California in the late 1970s was a land of sun-drenched streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and a sense of promise that life in the suburbs would always be safe. Families painted the picture of normalcy, children riding bicycles along quiet cul-de-sacs, couples tending to flower beds, and neighbors exchanging friendly waves over backyard fences. But beneath this tranquil veneer, an unseen menace was beginning to stir. It started with a few isolated incidents in Sacramento, incidents that seemed random at first. Women reported home invasions late at night, men breaking in through unlocked doors or small windows, silently overpowering them before disappearing into the darkness. At first, authorities treated these as isolated robberies or sexual assaults, cases that could happen anywhere. But soon a chilling pattern emerged. Every attack had a signature. The perpetrator moved with precision, showed no signs of panic, and seemed to have studied the households in advance. He was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and calculated, leaving no fingerprints or evidence behind. Detectives who arrived at the first crime scenes were struck by the eerie calm with which the attacks had been carried out. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't messy, it was methodical. The victims, traumatized and terrified, recounted the same details. A man who knew the layout of the house, who seemed to anticipate their movements, who whispered threats in a voice that was both ordinary and chilling. The press quickly dubbed him the East Area Rapist, though little was known about him beyond the terror he left behind. The suburban streets that once represented safety now echoed with anxiety. Women started walking in pairs after dark. Children no longer rode their bikes freely. Neighbors installed locks, bars on windows, and even improvised alarms. Communities that had once been tightly knit began to fracture under the weight of fear, suspicion creeping into everyday interactions. Every creak in the night, every shadow on the wall became a potential threat. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace. At the time, California's police departments were fragmented, communication between counties was poor, and resources were limited. Detectives worked tirelessly, reviewing every lead, interviewing neighbors, and analyzing crime scenes, but the East Area Rapist always seemed one step ahead. In the small town of Citrus Heights, one woman remembered the night vividly. She had gone to bed early, assuming her doors were locked. When she awoke, a stranger was standing in her bedroom doorway, his eyes cold and calculating. She screamed, he fled. The terror lingered long after. What made the East Area Rapist even more terrifying was not just his ability to evade capture, it was his psychological manipulation. Victims were often bound and gagged, left in positions meant to humiliate and terrify. Some were taunted by notes or threats left behind, messages that suggested he had been watching them, learning their routines, and that he could strike again at any moment. Each incident was meticulously staged, almost ritualistic, a horrifying dance of control. The narrative also shifts to law enforcement, showing the human side of the investigation. Detectives spent countless sleepless nights poring over crime scene photos, mapping patterns, and meeting with frightened communities. Some detectives were deeply affected by the nature of the attacks. One officer later recounted feeling a sense of helplessness that haunted him for years. They had the drive and the skills, but the criminal they pursued was exceptionally intelligent, methodical, and patient, a predator who thrived in anonymity. By the end of 1978, the East Area Rapist had claimed more victims, and law enforcement began to realize the gravity of the situation. What started as random home invasions was evolving into a serial pattern, a reign of terror that was spreading across Northern California. Families no longer felt safe in their own homes. The killer's audacity grew, and with it the media coverage intensified. Newspapers printed chilling headlines, interviews with frightened victims, and updates on the investigation, feeding both fear and morbid fascination. This part of the story also introduces a subtle psychological angle. The perpetrator is depicted as a man who blends into society by day, perhaps even familiar to the victims, a neighbor or passerby who would never raise suspicion. By night, he becomes a shadow, moving silently, striking unpredictably. The duality is disturbing, someone capable of normalcy in public and horror in private. This contrast creates suspense for the audience, who are drawn into both the terror experienced by the victims and the mystery surrounding the criminal. Even as fear escalates, there are glimmers of resilience. Some neighborhoods began organizing community watches. Families reinforce their homes with locks, alarms, and vigilance. Local leaders hold meetings to advise citizens on safety, while detectives work tirelessly to understand the criminal's patterns. Yet despite these efforts, the East Area Rapist remains elusive. Every time the authorities close in, he vanishes, leaving behind frustration, terror, and unanswered questions.
By the early 1980s, California's suburban streets were no longer places of safety. They were territories marked by fear, shadowed by a predator who had grown bolder, more audacious, and more terrifying. The man once known as the East Area Rapist had evolved. His crimes, once limited to home invasions and sexual assaults, now escalated to murder. The press coined a new name for him in Southern California, the original Night Stalker, a label that would send chills through families across the state. The pattern of terror had become more sophisticated. Victims were no longer simply attacked in random homes. The killer meticulously chose targets. He observed their routines, learned when doors were locked, when the lights went out, and when they were most vulnerable. He studied their habits as though preparing for a performance only he would ever see. And then, without warning, he struck. Detectives noticed the shift. Sacramento's East Area Rapist cases had been terrifying enough, but now the crimes bore a deadly signature: murder. Bodies were found in homes, some in bedrooms, some in garages, bound and left in positions that suggested control and dominance. Every detail was deliberate, every act calculated to instill fear far beyond the immediate victims. The killer was no longer content with terror alone. He craved ultimate control, a power over life and death that left an indelible mark on the communities he haunted. In one small town in Ventura County, a young couple returned home after a late movie. The garage door, left partially open, hid a silent intruder. Within moments, the home erupted in terror, screams, scuffles, and the eerie calm of a man who had planned every detail. The couple survived, but the incident left an entire neighborhood shaken. Families locked doors, double-checked windows, and spoke in hushed tones of a man who could appear anywhere, at any time, unseen, unstoppable. Law enforcement, now recognizing a statewide pattern, scrambled to coordinate across counties. Task forces were formed, detectives shared reports, and investigators began mapping every known attack. Yet, despite increased resources, the killer remained elusive. The original East Area Rapist had vanished from Northern California, only to reemerge in Southern California with a vengeance, leaving authorities scrambling to catch up. The story also delves into the victims' perspectives, giving the audience a visceral understanding of the fear that had become part of daily life. A woman recalls lying in bed, listening to the faintest creak of a floorboard, imagining the shadow of a man moving silently outside her window. Children slept uneasily, parents feared for their families, and neighbors whispered rumors of someone lurking nearby. Each day carried the weight of uncertainty. Each night became a gauntlet of vigilance. What made the killer terrifying was not just his violence, but his intelligence. Unlike many criminals, he left no fingerprints, no personal clues, nothing to directly connect him to the crimes. He was patient, waiting hours in the shadows, watching families, noting habits, learning routines. In some cases, he even interacted with the victims in small, seemingly inconsequential ways during the day, only to strike with devastating precision at night. This duality, normalcy by day, predator by night, made him almost mythical in the eyes of the public. Media coverage amplified the fear. Newspapers and television broadcasts reported every attack, every near miss, every murder. The story of the East Area rapist transforming into the original Night Stalker became national news. While authorities warned communities to remain vigilant, the press often sensationalized the crimes, inadvertently feeding the killer's ego. He was aware of the coverage, aware of the panic, and the attention only fueled his meticulous planning. In the law enforcement offices, detectives worked tirelessly, analyzing patterns, reviewing photos, interviewing witnesses, and mapping the attacks. They noticed a chilling consistency. The killer always struck when the victim was most vulnerable, often disabling or restraining them before moving to more sinister acts. Some investigators theorized about his psychology, suggesting that he was a man obsessed with control, someone who relished the fear and submission of his victims. Others speculated that he must have a background in law enforcement or military training, given his calculated movements and understanding of investigative methods. The tension escalates as Part 2 introduces a series of particularly shocking incidents. In one small town in Ventura County, a home invasion ends in murder, the crime scene so meticulously arranged that it confounds investigators. The killer leaves behind nothing, yet his signature, the careful staging, the restraints, the psychological manipulation, is unmistakable. Residents are now terrified not only for themselves, but for their neighbors, realizing that the predator could strike at any time in any house. This section of the story also highlights near misses and suspenseful escapes, drawing the audience into the action. In one scene, a man returning late from work notices a shadow in his garage. Heart racing, he freezes, realizing he is not alone. The intruder hesitates, observing, then retreats without a sound. These moments of tension heighten the narrative, allowing viewers to experience fear alongside the victims. As the years pass, the Golden State Killer's crimes continue to grow in number and severity. Police frustration mounts, leads dry up, witnesses remember fleeting details, none concrete enough to identify the perpetrator. Families live in constant vigilance, communities organize patrols, and the media dubs him the man who can't be caught. The combination of terror, elusiveness, and brutality cements his place as one of California's most notorious criminals.
By the mid-1980s, the Golden State Killer had become a legend of terror, a phantom stalking California's suburbs and leaving law enforcement grasping at shadows. The spree of attacks, now spanning multiple counties, had evolved into a statewide crisis. Detectives were no longer investigating isolated incidents. They were chasing a methodical predator whose crimes defied logic, leaving an entire state gripped with fear. Authorities pooled resources, forming task forces across Sacramento, Ventura, Orange, and Los Angeles counties. For the first time, detectives from different jurisdictions communicated regularly, comparing crime scene notes, witness statements, and reports. The goal was clear: identify patterns, locate the perpetrator, and prevent further attacks. Yet, despite these efforts, the killer remained elusive. His meticulous planning, careful surveillance, and uncanny ability to evade detection left investigators frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly desperate. Witnesses provided fragmented recollections, each offering fleeting details that seemed significant but led nowhere. One neighbor remembered a man in a dark jacket pacing the street at night. Another recalled hearing a low hum of a car engine outside a home minutes before an attack. But these details, though tantalizing, provided no concrete lead. The Golden State Killer's intelligence was staggering. He seemed to anticipate police work, avoiding routes where patrols might notice him and erasing traces that could identify him. Detectives began studying the psychology behind the crimes. Profilers suggested a man obsessed with control, someone who derived satisfaction from the fear and helplessness of his victims. His attacks were carefully staged, designed to dominate without leaving evidence. The idea that such a predator could blend into society during the day was almost unthinkable. Some investigators speculated he might have law enforcement or military training, given the precision and patience demonstrated in his actions. Others feared he was a man they might know, a neighbor or coworker, someone who walked unnoticed among ordinary citizens. The narrative also highlights the human cost of fear. Families lived in constant vigilance, locking doors, installing alarms, and checking windows at all hours. Children's laughter was replaced with whispered caution. Parents hesitated to leave the house alone, and communities were torn apart by suspicion. A single knock at the door could cause heart-stopping panic. A shadowy figure in the distance could paralyze a family with fear. Even after years, survivors of attacks carried trauma that never fully healed, forever haunted by the night a predator invaded their lives. Amidst the terror, law enforcement pursued every lead. Tip lines flooded with hundreds of calls each week, many from well-meaning citizens desperate to help. Investigators interviewed potential suspects, traced vehicles, and examined patterns of break-ins and attacks. Some leads seemed promising, but ultimately fizzled, the suspect either having an ironclad alibi or showing no connection to the crimes. Each dead end amplified the sense of frustration. The Golden State Killer was always one step ahead. The story weaves in suspenseful, cinematic moments. In one sequence, a detective drives through a quiet neighborhood late at night, flashlight in hand, heart pounding as he investigates a reported prowler. Minutes stretch into hours, and every shadow raises the tension. Outside, a faint movement, a car door closing, ignites hope, but it turns out to be nothing. The scene captures the relentless pressure, the emotional exhaustion, and the ever-present fear that the criminal is watching from the darkness. At the same time, the Golden State Killer continues to refine his methods. Break-ins become faster, attacks more precise, and escape routes carefully planned. He leaves no personal evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, at least not yet identifiable, no witness able to describe his face in detail. In his own mind, he is untouchable, a ghost moving invisibly through the homes and lives of ordinary Californians. The media sensationalizes the case, reporting every attack in lurid detail. While public awareness helps in some ways, neighbors watch out for one another, it also fuels panic. People lock themselves indoors, avoid nighttime travel, and whisper rumors of a man who could be anyone, someone ordinary hiding a monstrous secret. The Golden State Killer, in effect, has weaponized fear itself, controlling not just individuals but entire communities. Investigators grapple with the psychological toll of the investigation. Many officers admit to sleepless nights, anxiety about leaving their own families unprotected, and mounting frustration at the inability to capture a man who seems to anticipate their every move. The pressure is relentless. At the same time, the victims' stories haunt them. The terror in a woman's eyes, the trembling hands of a child, the grief of families who lost loved ones. These human stakes make the pursuit intensely personal, fueling the investigators' determination even as they confront their own limitations. The narrative introduces a series of false leads that heighten suspense. One suspect, a man with a criminal record and a car matching witness descriptions, is pursued across multiple counties. Detective teams surveil him for days, only to discover he has no connection to the attacks. Another lead surfaces in a different county based on a fleeting detail from a victim's memory. Hours of investigation yield nothing but frustration. Each failed lead amplifies tension, drawing the audience deeper into the emotional and investigative maze. Yet, despite these setbacks, law enforcement continues to innovate. Early forensic methods, careful crime scene analysis, and interagency collaboration slowly began to form a clearer picture of the perpetrator. They notice subtle consistencies, the timing of attacks, the use of restraints, the selection of victims, and patterns in behavior. While these observations do not yet lead to an arrest, they establish a framework that will prove critical in the decades to come. Decades had passed since the Golden State Killer first emerged from the shadows, terrorizing California's quiet neighborhoods. The memory of his crimes lingered like a persistent, unshakable shadow. Families had rebuilt their lives, investigators had moved on, and communities slowly tried to reclaim the innocence lost to fear. Yet for those who had survived, and for law enforcement who had spent years chasing a ghost, closure seemed impossible. The Golden State Killer was the epitome of elusiveness, a predator who had vanished into anonymity, leaving behind a trail of horror that time could not erase. The breakthrough came in the early 2010s, not through eyewitnesses or old surveillance, but through a remarkable advancement in forensic technology, genetic genealogy. Investigators revisited DNA evidence collected from decades-old crime scenes, evidence that had previously yielded no match. With painstaking precision, they used online genealogy databases to trace familial connections, mapping out potential suspects through distant relatives. This approach, groundbreaking and meticulous, breathed new life into the cold case files that had haunted detectives for years. As investigators narrowed their focus, the pieces began to align in a way previously unimaginable. One name emerged with chilling clarity: Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer whose life had outwardly appeared ordinary, even mundane. To the world, he was a neighbor, a family man, a man who had served his community. But beneath that normalcy lay a terrifying secret, a man responsible for the unspeakable crimes that had paralyzed California with fear. The revelation struck both law enforcement and the public. The predator they had hunted for decades had once walked among them in plain sight. DeAngelo's arrest was methodical and precise, almost poetic in its symmetry with the careful planning he had applied to his crimes. Law enforcement executed the operation with caution, aware that decades of evasion had made him both intelligent and dangerous. As he was led into custody, the reality of the capture hit like a shockwave across the state. Families, investigators, and even the nation exhaled collectively. A man who had terrorized entire communities was finally behind bars. The courtroom became a stage for decades of trauma, fear, and justice. Survivors recounted the horrors they had endured, the quiet nights shattered by intrusion, the helplessness of being overpowered, the lasting scars of fear that had followed them for years. Each testimony was a testament to the human cost of the Golden State Killer's reign, a chilling reminder that statistics and headlines could never capture the full magnitude of suffering inflicted. The prosecution meticulously laid out the timeline of DeAngelo's crimes, connecting DNA evidence to each attack and demonstrating the terrifying consistency of his methods. The details of his calculated approach were revealed to a stunned public, illustrating a man whose meticulousness extended beyond crime scenes to his very life, where normalcy was a mask that concealed monstrous behavior. As the trial unfolded, the psychological impact of the Golden State Killer's actions became increasingly apparent. Survivors struggled with closure, grappling with relief that justice had been served and the lingering pain of the trauma that had shaped their lives. Families, once fractured by fear, now faced a complicated reckoning. The man responsible for their nightmares had been someone who appeared ordinary, someone who could have been anyone in their neighborhood. This duality, so central to the Golden State Killer's identity, lingered as a haunting lesson for society. The narrative also reflects on the law enforcement journey, the tireless, decades-long pursuit that finally paid off. Detectives who had once followed dead ends, who had pored over crime scene photographs and witness statements, could now see the full arc of their work come to fruition. Their persistence, combined with the innovation of forensic science, ultimately triumphed over one of the most elusive criminals in American history. Yet the emotional toll remained. Sleepless nights, frustration, and the haunting faces of victims could not be erased, even with justice served. The capture of D'Angelo did more than end a decades-long manhunt. It reshaped criminal investigation itself. The use of genetic genealogy as a tool for solving cold cases became a groundbreaking precedent. Law enforcement agencies across the country began applying these techniques to other unsolved crimes, revolutionizing the approach to cases once considered impossible to solve. The Golden State Killer, in a darkly ironic twist, became a catalyst for progress, forcing the justice system to evolve in ways that would save countless future victims. Yet even with justice achieved, the story does not shy away from the lingering fear and trauma. Communities that had once been terrorized struggled to reconcile their past with their present. Survivors navigated a complex web of emotions: relief, lingering fear, anger, and sorrow. The narrative emphasizes that while the criminal was captured, the shadow of his actions would never fully dissipate. Memories of fear, the loss of innocence, and the scars left on families remained enduring legacies of his crimes. The story closes with a chilling reflection on the duality of evil. Joseph James D'Angelo had led a life of apparent normalcy, his true self hidden beneath the mask of a suburban father and former officer. Yet within that facade lay the mind of a predator whose crimes had shattered countless lives. The lesson is sobering. Evil can reside behind ordinary faces, and vigilance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice are essential to confronting it. The final scene is cinematic, almost haunting. The camera pans over California's suburbs, quiet streets, dimly lit homes, families asleep, shadows stretching across lawns. Somewhere in the distance, the memory of fear lingers, a whisper of the past that shaped a generation. Yet in the same frame, law enforcement and forensic experts are seen working in labs, piecing together evidence, ensuring that the dark legacy of the Golden State Killer leads not to despair, but to progress, prevention, and justice. The audience is left with a mixture of closure and lingering unease, a reflection on the extraordinary lengths a criminal can go to hide in plain sight, and the extraordinary lengths humans must go to uncover the truth. The Golden State Killer's story concludes not merely with a criminal behind bars, but with the enduring reminder that justice, though delayed, can ultimately prevail, and that vigilance, innovation, and resilience are humanity's most powerful tools.